Welcome, everyone, to Textiles and Tea with the Handweavers Guild of America. I'm Kathy Group. I'm your host today. I'm the advertising manager for HGA. We want to thank our sponsors. First off, we have a joint sponsorship today. It's Real Fibers and Paper Connection International. We're so excited that they're joining us today. We appreciate their sponsorship. And as always, the questions are at the end of the session today. About 45 minutes in, we'll do questions. Please put them in the Q&A and not in the chat. I just can't always see them when they're in the chat. Love your comments, though. Keep those comments going. Those were wonderful. We are so excited to have Rowland Ricketts today. Roland utilizes natural dyes and historical processes to create contemporary textiles that span art and design. Trained in an indigo farming and dyeing in Japan, Roland received his MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art in 2005, and he's a professor at Indiana University School of Art, Architecture, and Design. He's a recipient of the United States Artist Fellowship. His work has been exhibited at Textiles Museum in Washington, D.C., the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Renwick Gallery, and the Seattle Art Museum. And we are so excited to have him here today. Hey, Roland, how are you?
Fine, thanks.
I am glad you're here.
Thank you so much.
Also, because you're doing an installation, so you're out of town. So we appreciate you going through the effort to join us.
Well, thank you.
Well, let's start with a really important question. What is your favorite tea?
Well, I don't drink coffee anymore, so my favorite teas are actually just black teas, Assam, Ceylon, straight.
Did you learn to like tea when you were in Japan, or did you drink a lot of tea while you were in Japan?
Yeah, I did actually. There's such great teas and such wonderful variety of teas. We even tried harvesting our own and making our own.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, we'll have to get into that one too. You are so well known for indigo. So how did you get started? Oh, wait a minute. How did you get started in fiber in general?
Generally, so I really I didn't really, growing up, I didn't really know that much about, I didn't really know anything about dyeing, weaving, anything like that. It wasn't anything on my radar. But when I graduated from college, I went to Japan to teach on the JET program, the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. Mm-hmm. And while there, I'd been doing a lot of photography, actually. And this was pre-digital, so black and white photography. And the high school that I taught at, we had a dark room, so it was really great. And I started a photo club, and I was teaching the students about printing black and white. But at the same time, I kind of moved out into the countryside, into an old farmhouse. And I realized pretty quickly that all of the wastewater, all the gray water, essentially non-sewage, was going right into the stream. And this was true for the high school where I was teaching as well. So anything we were putting down the drain in the darkroom was going right into into the local rivers. And that kind of opened my eyes for the first time of the way that our creating things, the way we make things, can have the way we make things has an impact on the environment. And so I stopped doing photography, and I met some folks right as I was like, well, what else can I do? I met some folks who were working with natural dyes, and they were very conscious. They went out, they gathered plants, and they were using non-toxic mordants, and were very conscious about what they were doing. And those folks really kind of introduced me to natural dyes, which was then my first real introduction to fibers as well.
Well, how did you focus in on indigo? What was the attraction of indigo then?
A couple of things, really. I think one of the things was, I was dyeing a lot of things. I didn't really know what to make, so I was dyeing clothing and things like that. And you wash them a couple times, and things are going to fade, right? It's not meant for sort of practical wear. So the folks I was studying natural dyes with, they didn't work with indigo, but they kind of sort of steered me in that direction. They said, in Japan, there's this long history of growing indigo and processing and dyeing with it. And it's a wash fast dye. And so I really, again, I knew nothing about it, but it sparked my interest. And I thought, I taught English there for 3 years in public schools. And I felt like I didn't want to leave just having taught English. I kind of wanted to bring something back with me. And so when my teaching contract was up, I was able to set up an apprenticeship in Tokushima, Japan, on the island of Shikoku, which is where indigo is still grown on the largest scale. And I spent a year working with a farmer there who still grows and processes indigo into the dye stuff, and then spent a year with a family of dyers, learning how to take that dye stuff and transfer its color to cloth. So it wasn't particularly direct, but I always felt like I wanted to bring something back with me that was more than just teaching English there. So
you were teaching English in Japan.
Yep.
Well, how'd that come about?
Well, so I went to Japan for the first time when I was in ninth grade.
Oh, wow, really?
10th grade, in between, I think 9th and 10th grade. My high school had a short-term exchange with a group from there, and so my family hosted a student, and then I went with the group from my school to Japan that summer, and it was really kind of amazing because I had no idea about anything really beyond America, and it was amazing, a wonderful experience. And I always felt like, I wanted to learn the language. So then the following summer, I went back on a language study program. And then and started studying then. And then when I went to college, I picked a school where I could study Japanese. And that was really kind of the focus. And then I spent my junior year there at Doshisha University in Kyoto. But at the time, my interest, like I said, I was interested in architecture and photography. So, fibers came much later.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut.
Oh, okay. Okay. Are you from the Connecticut area originally?
Humorously, I was born there. And my parents were waiting for me to be born before they moved to Vermont. So I lived there for 4 weeks as an infant.
You're a
Technically,
native.
I was born in
You're a native.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to look at some images that are from a video that the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery put together. You were part of that Renwick International in 2020, and this is an exhibit that showcases mid-career and emerging artists. And the idea is to try to get more recognition for these types of artists. And first of all, I want to encourage anyone who wants to know more about the process of making indigo to watch this video. And I believe we're going to be able to put the address of that website so you can go look at it, because it's amazing to see this process. I mean, I've done indigo in workshops. This is a whole different animal, and it's just fascinating to watch. But I'm really curious because you do composting indigo, and I'm curious why.
So, when you look at indigo globally, there's sort of two main methods. This is a generalization, so this is like the 5-minute version. There's really sort of two main ways of getting the dye from plant to cloth or plant to fiber. And you have indigo is not found in one plant, it's found in lots and lots of different plants. But some are tropical, some are temperate, some are subtropical. So you have different plants in different regions. And then the method of making the dye from the plant is also based in the climate of those regions, right? So the most commonly known method is the extraction method. It's probably most commonly known because it yielded a dye stuff that could be dried to a cake form.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a very high indigo content. And because it could be dried to a cake form, it's easy to kind of pack up and ship around the world. So this was very popular with, European colonizers, and they spread that method of indigo extraction all around the world. This is what was done in the West Indies, in taken to the East Indies as well, and also here in the US. But the other indigo process is not an extraction process, and it's one of composting. And so in the extraction process, you take the leaves and you soak them in water until they decompose, and then you add lime and you beat the vat and you extract the indigo. That process works really, really well in a tropical climate where it's really hot. So they still do this in Japan, but in Okinawa, so way down in the South Pacific. The temperate regions, that's like you can do the same technique, but you're never going to get as high quality or as concentrated of an extract, because the waters, you just can't get the daytime and nighttime temperatures to really produce good indigo. So in temperate regions, people developed a method of composting. And what you do is you basically take the plants, you spread them out in the sun to dry. In our case, the Japanese indigo we're growing, we compost that, or we dry it, we winnow it by stomping on it, and then we pull out all the stems and we compost those leaves. And what happens, the indigo is only found in the leaves, and it's the composting process that takes the dye stuff that's in the leaves and concentrates it so that you can dye a very, very dark color. So unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, this was very, very similar, almost identical to what was done with woad in Europe. But it leaves you with a dye stuff that's very bulky. It's maybe 5% indigo if you're lucky.
Oh.
And so it just didn't lend itself to sort of global trade and shipping around the world because it's so bulky. And because of it, that's part of the reason why then these other indigos kind of conquered, shall we say, the woad, for example, in Europe, and that tradition was sort of vanquished.
There's just so much information about indigo. It seems like every time I hear someone talk about it, I learn so much more. It's a very complicated dye stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's really fascinating because it's complicated, and yet historically, people figured out these ways of getting the color into cloth that is actually very similar. But it's kind of amazing that people figured that out. At least I think it is.
Do you sell your dye, like online, or?
No, we've hoped over the years to be able to produce enough to sell, but it's really hard work, and we're able to produce enough for us to use each year, but then to sort of scale that up, we've tried to work with local farms and things, and everyone gets very excited in the spring when they're planting and transplanting, and then the first harvest comes and they're like, okay, you can have the rest of it if you just come harvest it. It's a lot of hard work, and I think one of the other challenges is simply the cost, right? If we're in Japan, a bale of indigo, which is about 56 kilos, sells for about maybe $1,200. And we can produce about, if we work really hard in the summer, we could maybe produce 5 bales a year. So when you do the math on that, it's just not worth it to sell it. Like we'd be paying to sell it. So the economics don't make sense.
Well, when I was asking that question, when I came up with that question, I was thinking about, that perfect scarf that you make and you just don't want to sell it because you worked so hard and you've put so much into it. And when I saw this video, I thought, I could never sell it. It would be like, I have worked too hard for this indigo. I am not selling it. So that's what I was curious about. But I never thought about the economics of it. Whew.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it kind of, it maps onto all kinds of sort of global economic discussions going back 300 years, 400 years,
Right.
Where there, you find cheaper ways to make it, and then keeping it becomes very challenging for those other traditions to survive financially.
Well, we've got an image of a dyeing system that you have, and I was just so fascinated when I saw this. It's like, I've got to ask about this. It is so cool. So it's a pulley system where you dip the cloth into these vats. So first of all, I have to ask, did you create this? Was this your idea?
No, no, not at all.
Okay.
This is based on ones that my teacher used, but you see similar sorts of things, even in Europe with the blue dyers.
Uh-huh.
They'll have sort of, they'll be working often with round vats, and they'll have sort of something spiraling that they can hook the cloth onto to suspend it. But it's kind of a way of economizing as you're dyeing and holding the cloth. You know, you don't want it to stick to itself and whatnot. So it's a way of being able to handle it without creating tons of problems.
Well, again, going back to my little dye workshop I went to, I remember, how hard it was to get that thread in there and make sure it was getting in the bundles and everything. That's why I was so fascinated by this system, that you could just dip it all at once, and not that you can do the gradation so much easier some way too.
Yes, yeah, you can. And this is for things that are not either not patterned or patterned with a paste resist. But again, like, if you're doing some sort of stitched resist, Shibori, I couldn't use this. I'd have to get in there with my hands and move it around.
So you mentioned historical, so let's talk some about that, because historically, natural dyes and indigo, especially, and some of the reds and everything, have played such an important role in history and in economies. I mean, it was, you could get shot for trying to take, colors outside a country because they were so well regarded, and and they took over countries because they wanted access to those dyes. So was that part of the attraction? Was that historical and economical history?
Not initially, no. I was like in my early 20s when I think I was 24 when I first discovered indigo, and I was like, this is so cool. That was about the extent of my thinking. It was not very developed. But I'm now more than twice as old as I was then. So as I've worked with this dye, I've learned so much more about its history. And that's, to me, that's something that's very fascinating. And it's part of the sort of the material's history, right? And like you were saying, in Japan, the area of Tokushima where I studied became really famous for indigo production because they developed about 450 years ago, they invested heavily in sort of research and development, and they came up with this like highly refined system of composting. And you would go to school and you would be trained as what was called a water master to add, so you went around from house to farm and you added water to their composting indigo and got the mix just right. And if you were trained in that school and you left the kingdom, the prefecture at the time, and were caught, you'd be executed. So similar sort of histories of trying to maintain that knowledge. But then we also have, so that's one system. And then I think with colonialism, there's a whole other system that comes into play. That's sort of a much darker system. Whether that's, through all sorts of labor, including slave labor in the US, and similar systems in India. The movement for independence in India started on indigo plantations in Bihar because the working conditions were so horrible. So, I think that there's a lot of, there's just a lot of sort of fascinating and troubling history. I think, I like I said, I lived in Japan, I studied there, and then coming back to the States and sort of wondering about, what is the history of indigo here? And it's very dark. Whereas in Japan, it's often sort of this nostalgic, this sort of symbol of a simpler time in the past. There's sort of a nostalgia associated with it. Whereas here, I think it's very relevant to a lot of conversations that are still happening today.
Well, you had talked about how at one point they I'm going to get this wrong, but that some province or whatever couldn't pay their taxes in rice, so they came up with another way. Would you share that?
So this is in Tokushima, the same prefecture where I studied and where indigo is still grown on the largest scale today. There's a huge river that runs right through the middle of this huge fertile basin in the prefecture. But at the time in the 1600s, all of the daimyo, the local feudal lords, were required to pay taxes to the shogun in what is now Tokyo, and they were required to pay those in taxes, God, they were required to pay them in rice, and so so they had to pay their taxes in rice, but the typhoon season is kind of similar to here, right? So you get into September and October when you're going to be harvesting your rice, and these huge typhoons would come through, and the whole area would flood, and you would and they would lose their crops year after year, and then they couldn't pay their taxes, and so they decided to find another crop that they could use in place of rice to grow, that they could then sell outside their region, sell nationally throughout Japan, and get paid in rice so that they could pay their taxes, and they went with indigo. And I think what's kind of interesting, as I was saying, then they made these huge investments in research and development, figured out the best way to make it, and they were highly guarded trade secrets. But that investment, 450 years ago, is still evident today, right? Because it's still the area where they're growing indigo on the largest scale. And then, interestingly enough, for Japan, I think we tend to think of this like indigo being something very historical, but the most land was under cultivation with indigo in like 1913 or 1920, somewhere around there, 1917. I forget the exact year, but right around there. So just over 100 years ago, a lot of acreage in Japan was being used to grow indigo, and it's really up until World War II, there was still quite a good amount of indigo production, and then after the war, that all sort of faded.
Well, let's look at some of your work. It's just beautiful. These next pieces are from the Unbound series, which was inspired by the American coverlets. And visually, they're outstanding. And I'm sure viewers, like all the fiber types who are watching, would just be captivated by just the pieces themselves. But for you, there was also more to these textiles than just the visual. And you actually stated on your website, the materials content of these textiles speak much more directly to our nation's history than any visual story they tell. So can you talk more about the meaning of the material and the weave structure and what that statement was about?
Yeah, so in living in Indiana, my wife and I love antiques, and so we go to antique shops, and when we moved there, we started going, and we'd find coverlets, mostly 19th century, pre-Civil War coverlets, and I sort of started studying those. I've been studying them for maybe 6 or 7 years now, pretty intensely, and I got really fascinated with the way that they have been talked about as objects, right? So they've been sort of elevated as these beautiful things, these ideas of like the independent weaver living on the frontier, and they sort of symbolize something in the American psyche. But when you actually look at them materially, most of them are woven with mill-spun cotton that was grown by slaves. And then the dyes that were used were largely imported. They weren't locally grown. You look at these old advertisements from the 1830s and 40s, and they talk about, we've got Bengal indigo, we've got the best madder, that's the best imported madder. cochineal, right? These are not things that they were raising in Indiana in the 1830s. And so to me, you know, though, and those dyes were completely tied up in colonialism and global trade, you know, hundreds of years prior. And so we kind of think of these things as these sort of nostalgic, romantic, oh, you know, here are these beautiful coverlets woven, you know, this image is sort of someone sitting there spinning, you know, growing the cotton. And in fact, you know, the materials that they're made of tell a much more realistic story of our country, right? The materials talk of sort of slave labor and global trade and all these things. Whereas, you know, we tend to think of like I said, the independent person out there working on the frontier. And so what I did was for these, I used the ground. Typically, you know, you would weave these with for all the weavers out there, they all know you weave these with a undyed ground. And then you dye the pattern yarn, the supplemental weft, the overshot would be dyed. But I did these a little bit differently. For the ground, I used patterns from trade books that were patterns that were used for cloth in the slave trade. So these are patterns from English, British mills where they would weave the checks and plaids in the ground were copied from those mills that would then take that cloth to Africa to buy the lives of others. So, and then once woven, I put these out in the sun to fade. And then I unwove them. So you kind of get this imprint or kind of like a contact print or a photographic exposure over time of fading, and how you know, much like our memories fade, the way we think of the way that we historicize something and the way we come to think about it isn't always clear, and it isn't really true to what it was. It's kind of like an image of something. So I'm kind of using the fading in that way.
That's amazing. That's beautiful, just beautiful. So this next images are from the series called Work Time. And this was at the Museum of Contemporary Craft in Portland, Oregon. This just looks amazing. It's one of these, I wish I could have been there to see it. You did not start, I'm assuming, because it's huge. It's just huge how big this installation is. And I'm assuming you did not start off making these huge installations. So can you talk some about your journey from beginning dyeing to these installations?
Yeah, certainly. I have kind of a funny story. You know, when we first got started, I talked to a good friend of mine who was a very established dyer in Japan, and he said, you know, we were still living in Japan. My wife, we had moved to Shimane Prefecture so that my wife could do an apprenticeship in double ikat kasuri weaving. And so we rented a small, you know, a small farm, and we were, you know, I was growing indigo and processing it, and a friend of mine said that we should just do an exhibit at home. We should make a bunch of things and do an exhibit at home. And so I worked for a year and I made all this stuff, and we did this exhibit, and it got picked up by the local newspaper and then a regional newspaper, and all these people came. Like it was crazy. And we sold basically everything I had made that year, and I was all excited, and I'm like, this is great. And then I sat down and counted the money, and it was like $3,000. You can tell I'm not good. I'm just not a good business person. And I realized in that moment that it's really hard to make a go of it. With textiles are part of global trade. They have been for hundreds of years, and you're kind of competing in these very strange markets. And so a little bit after that, I went back to visit this friend who had said, you know, do this exhibit at your house. And he was in the process of building a new house and studio. And I was like, how have you done this? Like, it is so hard. You know, I did this exhibit like you suggested, and I made enough to survive, you know, a month or two. And how have you done this? And he looked at me and he said, handkerchiefs. handkerchiefs. I've done it all with handkerchiefs. I sell handkerchiefs to the tourist trade in Tokushima because people come there and they want indigo. And he's like, I built this whole house on handkerchiefs. And I had this moment where I'm just like, I don't want to spend my whole life dyeing handkerchiefs. Like it's just that's not for me. There's all these other things about indigo, about growing it and processing it, and sort of the awe and wonder of starting with seeds and ending with dyed cloth, that to me were the really exciting things. And wanting to kind of figure out how you capture that and express that is what led me to doing installations and working in this sort of immersive, really immersive environment.
Well, this is a great segue into the next exhibit we're going to talk about, which is the mobile section. And this was in the Seattle Asian Art Museum, the ones we're looking at. And it's so cool because when I first saw it, I just saw the cloth, and there was this dark section in the middle. I was like, oh, I wonder how you got that dark. And later I realized what it was is this is indigo on the wall, and it was the shadow of the indigo. And what is so unique is what you just said, is that when I listen to you talk about your work, it's like your work starts from growing the indigo. That is part of the exhibit as well as the final product. It's all part of the art for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly enough, it comes back to at the end of the day, sort of recycling this back into the work. So all of the indigo that was on the wall in this exhibit was first this was first shown at the MFA Boston, and then it went to the Seattle Asian Art Museum. And then when it was done, all of that indigo was winnowed, and those dried leaves were composted and have turned into other things. So there's sort of this beautiful cycle that's happening as well. And there was one other thing I was going to, part of the reason of incorporating the plants here is to kind of hopefully raise that question. Like people, I'm not giving too much information. Initially I wanted to include plants simply because they have this very beautiful, like almost sweet smell when they're dried, kind of like hay. Oh. And it's a very specific smell, but it's very pleasant. And so for me, it has, like, I smell that and I have so many memories of year after year working with indigo. So there's sort of this other factor, not just the visual. But then at the same time, also to kind of, people can see the blue leaves. It's kind of an amazing plant when you dry it and the leaves turn from green to blue. And then wanting to kind of get people thinking about all the, this is one like historical way of making, right? Of taking, how did people figure out, how do you get the color from that leaf into this dyed cloth, right? It's to kind of get people thinking about that and wondering about it. And hopefully then looking around, we take everything, everything we have is made, right? But we take it all, we don't really think about that, how things come into being. So hopefully by putting the plants in there, it kind of sparks some of those conversations.
Well, tell us some more about the fiber part of it, if you would.
Yeah, so the fiber part it's a ramie or hemp material that's been dyed and then dyed in gradation. One of those early pictures you had of me with the vat dyeing something really tall, that was actually the cloth for this. And part of the idea here was it's kind of, if you've been in a rural area, you've probably seen grain bins on farms. This is modeled on a grain bin one of my neighbors has. And the sort of idea of what's being, with the grain bin, you're harvesting your corn, you're putting it in there, right? In our case, we're kind of harvesting this color. So by putting the viewer in the middle, it's lit from the outside, and the light, casts this beautiful kind of blue glow on the inside. So that's my idea, was that what's being sort of harvested and captured there is that color, which is immaterial at the end of the day, right? Because color indigo is a material, but color is just the reflection of a wavelength of light. So, I think it's kind of humorous that I work really hard to make something that's immaterial. and trying to capture that in that form.
Well, I had some I understood that what you were talking about. I grew up in southern Indiana on a farm. So when I was reading that about the silos, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, those are, I always feel like I'm getting closer to home when I start seeing silos in the distance. So I get that. Well, you do these dipping, simple dyeing. Well, I shouldn't say simple, nothing you do is simple, but you dip the cloth in. But I've also seen that you do manipulation of the cloth by doing shibori and some other techniques. And we've got images of some of these pieces. It's called runners, and these are amazing. And those of you who've ever tried to do shibori know that those little perfect circles are not easy to do. They are not easy to do. Do you find you like one technique over the other? And how do you choose which one do you want to do?
Well, to be honest, so I was trained as a when the dye studio that I apprenticed in did a lot of shibori, and I did a lot of shibori, and I did a lot of shibori for years. I got to a point, like I was doing a lot of very, very intense stitching and gathering and binding it very tightly. And I got to a point where like I'd go to bed at night and I'd wake up in the morning and I couldn't get my hands open. And I was like, I forget how old, 31, 32. And I thought like, this is not good. I can't keep doing this for my hands, right? And so I stopped and I started working with paste resist. So actually what you see on the left there, with all the polka dots, that's actually paste. And as you noted, it would be impossible to get these sort of perfect circles with not just the perfect circles, but then the perfectly dyed areas in between them. If you were doing shibori, this is done with a stenciled paste resist. They're just very different. I've done things recently where I use shibori. It honestly depends a lot on what you want the edge of the form to look like. Whether you want it clean, a very clean line, or whether you want something that is more uneven. So it really sort of depends on the project and what I'm doing and what makes sense for it.
Well, these are gorgeous. These are just beautiful. We've got all kinds of comments over here about the work. So next big question, what's next for you?
Next is actually right now. I'm here in Jacksonville, Florida, doing a new installation for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Jacksonville. They have this really neat Project Atrium, they call it. They invite artists to do installations there. It's a 3-story tall atrium space. So I'm in the middle of hanging this new installation there that opens on Thursday night. So
No
it'd be a
pressure.
busy few days. And at the same time, I just before coming down here, I got back from I was in Washington, D.C. doing research at the Smithsonian American History Museum, looking at their coverlets. And at IU, we now have a TC2 digital jacquard loom. So some of that earlier work with the coverlets, I was limited. Sorry, I know there's a lot of weaving fans out there. So I was weaving on a 16 harness AVL Dobby, manual Dobby. And so I was limited to the sorts of designs I could make, right? So I went with like star patterns and things like that. But now with the jacquard loom, I'm able to weave whatever. So I've been studying those jacquard coverlets, and I'm developing a new body of work sort of based on this study of history and that time period, and in indigo and cotton and all of these things that I've been talking about. So I'm very excited about that work as well, but it'll, it's weaving, so it's not super fast, right? I'm not turning out a new one every week, but that's the main things that I'm working on right now.
Well, I know you've got a relationship with Praxis. I know you've done some things with them, and I always think of TC2 when I think of them. Will you be teaching TC2 at IU?
I know there's a lot of students interested. We've done a workshop, so our graduate students have all learned how to use it. And I know our weaving class, I think, is meeting right now, and they may be watching. Hi, guys. I know there's a lot of interest, so I'm hoping to, in a future class, incorporate it and really kind of get people up and running on it, because it's very, it's actually really surprisingly easy to work with.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. Okay, I'm going to put a plug in here. All you students, we want to see your work. We want to see all the things that y'all are making. So come to Convergence, enter small expressions. We want to see your work, especially when you get that TC2 up and running. That's great. All right, we have got tons of questions. How about we start asking some, okay?
Great.
All right. This is from Debbie Ellis. I saw your astonishing installation at the Seattle Art Museum twice. Absolutely wonderful. I've purchased indigo seed from you. Do you have any for sale at this time?
No, we don't. And so, interestingly enough, any seed for next year's planting is not even flowers in the field yet. The seeds they drop in viability from year to year. So we make seeds available in usually like late January, early February.
Okay.
So watch out then.
So if they go to your website, they can
Yes.
find out. Okay.
Yeah. When we announce it through our like mailing list and through Instagram, social media, when they're available in the spring, well, winter. And then they're on our website.
Michaela McIntosh is asking, is the indigo that they're growing in Japan, is that from the Polygonum or an Indigo Pharaoh?
Polygonum.
Okay. Carolyn Wetzel, is there an effect on product if you dry the plants in the sun or in the shade?
That's a really good question. I don't think so.
Okay.
My thinking on that is, like I said, hundreds of years ago, people started developing the technique that I'm using today, and that if there were a better way of doing it, they would have found it. One thing that's been dropped from the process, but I think is interesting, that might force the plants to produce slightly more indigo, is the crushing of the leaves once they've been harvested. And that's kind of similar to what they would do with the woad mills in Europe, where they would take the woad leaves and then crush them under stone. In Japan, they would just use sort of it kind of looks like a piece of wood cut as a washboard on the end of a stick, and they'd rub it on the surface of the plants to kind of crush them. But no one does that anymore. So it's so much work, and does it really make that much of a difference? My sense is no.
Okay. Tracy Misserve. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right, Tracy. I apologize. Hello from the Textile Museum in DC. I would like to hear Roland talk about the fiber shed movement, which I know he has been involved in. You're a fiber shed person, huh?
Well, I've worked with a number of folks. You mentioned Praxis in Cleveland, and then Fibershed out in the Bay Area, to start growing indigo and composting it and using this method. So that's how I've worked with them. And I think it's a sort of fascinating idea, where I know as more and more people are thinking regionally, there's a lot of very, very interesting work that's happening out there in sort of the Hudson area. Laura Sansone and the work that she's doing with sheep and creating yarn, and then other products from locally sourced materials. And I know there's a group of us trying to kind of build something similar in Indiana. We keep talking about it, but we never have a chance to get together and move it forward.
This is a great question. Way to go, Barbara Walker. What happens to your installation pieces after the exhibits are over? Because you do something unique with some of them, I know, right?
Yeah, so some of them, different parts of them, for example, if we're using dried plants, like I said earlier, those get recycled back in. I'm not a huge fan of waste. So we've done things where I've done some where I did a project in Japan. I've done 2 projects in Japan, and in both of those, I sort of worked with larger communities. And when it was done, when the installations were done, the parts of the installation went back to all of those people. So, for example, one was a project around the National Cultural Festival in like 2016, I think it was. And I worked with dyers throughout Japan who used indigo from Tokushima. And we asked them to dye the cloth their most meaningful shade of blue. And then we brought those all back together for a large installation. And when the installation was done, it kind of went back to those dyers. Hopefully to solve, there's kind of this unfortunate reality there. I think that develops in a lot of small craft communities where there's different factions. And I was able to bring all those factions together for this very beautiful thing, and then hopefully impart that beauty of that experience and the memory of that into the cloth that they had dyed, and then send it back to them. So the most recent projects that I've been doing, we were able to work with Sally Fox and have yarn custom spun for it. So the project in Seattle and the one I'm doing here, we're using that same yarn, and everything has been warped. All the yarns have been warped as an actual warp, and so they can all be woven. So it's way more yarn than I could ever weave in my lifetime. So we're thinking about, once it's been shown, can it be sold as warps for people who want to work with that yarn and incorporate some of that history, right? It's been part of this exhibit, and now it's becoming something else, and the way that work can kind of live on in the world. So those are some examples. I kind of like being left with nothing at the end of the day.
Yeah, as much as you produce, I can understand that. Someone's asking, how deep are those vats? So that the large pieces don't hit the bottom. And and this was Deanie Warren. She said, very cool to see those vats.
Yeah, they're I don't know exactly, but they're probably about 4.5 feet deep.
Oh, wow.
So they're not super deep. But what I do is I put a mesh I suspend a mesh in there so that when I'm putting something in, it won't go to the bottom, because what is down there is composted indigo, and it's like pond muck. It's just and if you get it on the fiber that you're dyeing, whether it's cloth or yarn, you will not get it off. It's super, super fine. And it's brown. It looks kind of gross when it's dried. So you want to be really careful not to get your materials down into it.
Maureen Wilson says, is there a good source for learning how to do the composting, online or written?
Yeah, kind of. There's a fellow, Takayuki Ishii, and he self-published a book called, I think it's called like The Way of Indigo or something, like, I forget the exact name of it, but he's doing something really interesting, so where I studied in Japan, it was a huge commercial enterprise, right? Everybody was growing indigo, and it was people were working on a much larger scale, but indigo was being grown and processed throughout all of Japan. And there were a lot of, like, most people would just kind of do it on their own. They'd grow a small plot, they'd dry the leaves, and then they would compost in very, very small batches to make a single vat. And Takayuki Ishii, he's been leading workshops here in the States and in Japan at his place, and kind of teaching people how to do that much smaller batch composting.
Okay. Why do you prefer to dye with composted indigo Oh, I think we talked about this earlier. Does it dye much darker?
So, well, I think it's a really good question. I don't know if I touched on it, like why that indigo over others, right? I think the biggest reason for me is because it's a process that was developed in a temperate region,
Mhm.
much like where I live. I don't live in the tropics, and it's kind of a closed loop system, right? Like I start with seeds, and then I raise the plants, I harvest them, I dry them. The leaves contain all the bacteria not only necessary for making the compost, but then the compost contains the bacteria necessary for fermentation. So I didn't really talk about the vats themselves and what's in them, but I can, again, starting with the seeds, everything I need to do the dyeing is kind of in there already. And at the end of the day, the vats are living. They have a lifespan of 6 months to a year, depending how much I'm using them. And at the end of the day, when the vats die, I put them back on the field or on my garden or whatever. They're compost, right? And they're compost and wood ash, and so there's really nothing harmful in there. So I really continue to work that way because I think there's one other reason why I really continue to work that way. The vats are living, and as such, they can produce this really vibrant, vital color. Color kind of has a vitality to it, a glow to it. And I feel like that's from this process that I use. So that vitality comes from that process.
Oh, somebody wants to know, Sandra Miller wants to know, have you been to the Coverlet Museum in Pennsylvania?
Oh yes, many times. And if there's anyone here listening who hasn't been there to Bedford, Pennsylvania, you should definitely go. It's amazing.
And it's a two people show, and they have really dedicated themselves to.
Yeah, Melinda and Laszlo.
Yeah.
They're amazing folks.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place, and I encourage you all to go. Ramon Abernathy Payne. Hey, Ramona. May we please have the dates and details of the installation in Jacksonville?
Yes. But I may have to sneak a look at my calendar.
But it opens Thursday, right?
It opens Thursday. Yeah, I've got
Right.
that part down.
Is there an opening reception?
I believe so, yes. Although I'm like, I don't worry about those details. I just have to show up. So
You have bigger fish to fry right now.
Yes. I believe that wait, that can't be right. Oh yeah, it's up through the end of January, I believe, through January 29th.
Okay.
So
and what's the facility it's in? You may have said, I'm sorry.
It's the Museum of Contemporary Art, Jacksonville.
Okay. So if you're interested, you can also Google it, and they'll have all the information.
Yeah, they'll have all the details on there. Yeah. On their
so all of you in the Southeast, I'm visualizing a road trip in my future.
I'm down.
I know. I want to see this. Karen Campbell, the overshot pieces you unwove after they set in the sun, and then you wove them again into the items that we saw in the photos, and she's got question marks. So I'm assuming she's asking, is that correct?
So no, what I did was, for the weavers out there who have woven overshot will understand this, but you can remove the pattern yarn and you still basically just have a plain weave ground. And so that's all I did was I removed the pattern weft yarn.
Okay.
In some cases I removed it all. In some cases I removed parts. I kind of removed bits and kind of cut around, left other parts in. But they're sort of unwoven in that way.
I love how you think outside the box. You just approach from a different point of view, you should be an artist, Roland. You would be really good. Oh, and here's another one. Everybody is planning your future travels here. Are you aware of the Coverlet Museum at St. Vincent College in Latrobe?
No, I'm not. And I've been traveling to see Coverlet collections all over the place, and that one is not on my radar. So
Sandra, I don't know where Latrobe is. Is that Michigan? Donna Hudson, would you consider doing an installation at Newfields in Indianapolis? It'd be close.
It would be close. They have a neat atrium space there.
Oh, what is Newfields?
So Newfields is what the museum formerly known as the Indianapolis Museum of Art. I know it sounds like a grocery store name. I'm sorry.
Oh, I didn't know they
Didn't
changed
name
their
it.
name.
Yes.
Newfields. You're right. It does sound like a grocery store. Oops.
Yeah. Sorry if
what
anyone
was
from
it?
the anime is listening. Sorry, guys.
I know.
Personal
I'm probably
opinion.
going to get some comments from that now. Sandra came back and said, Latrobe is in Pennsylvania. I apologize to Pennsylvania.
True, Pennsylvania.
We got a few more minutes. Pamela Feldman wants to know who wove the coverlets that were shown in those slides. You did, right?
Yeah, I wove them.
Okay. Oh, and somebody wants to know, is your shirt indigo? And did you weave it?
I did not weave it. I did dye it. It was actually a dark blue and white check shirt
Really?
that I bought, and then it was kind of, the contrast was too much, and so I just overdyed it.
You're really hands-on. I like that. Karen LeBlanc. Hey, Karen, I'm intrigued with your installations. Can you talk about how you create some of the large systems for your installation? That was talked about in some of your videos, and it is pretty intense what you have to come up with to, because the size of the room changes or the lighting changes for every place you go, right?
Yeah, but like, I think weavers will all understand this, right? Like, weaving is, depending on what you're doing, it can be like 90-95% planning and setup, right? And then actually sitting and weaving is the and then the cloth you're left with has all that in it, but people don't see it, right? And it's very similar with the installations, like the project in Seattle, which I think was the very first slide you showed. That was 5 months of work with multiple people. And it was all planning and organization. And we had a whole system. You kind of have to develop systems to kind of keep, just like with weaving, to keep your work from getting tangled. You have to have your systems, and that really makes it all sort of possible. But each time, the variables are different, the space is different, the way that something may be mounted is different. So each time there's a lot of work in that goes, like this exhibit I'm setting up right now, someone came by yesterday and was like, oh, this is so amazing that you can make this happen in 3 days. You're going to make this installation happen. I'm like, no, this installation took months. You're just seeing the 3 days at the end where it all comes together and takes shape, right? So it's just like weaving, I think.
And then you have to work with the museum a lot, right? On how it's going to be staged and set up and exhibited.
Yeah, and when you working with museums and galleries and things, then you get into there's all sorts of rules, ADA requirements, fire marshals have their say in things. So there's there's a lot of things to take in consideration, and sometimes the first plan you come up with is has to be changed because it's too close to the wall, or it's there's a million reasons why things get changed. So there are some parameters that you end up having to work within.
Is that something that's taught in college?
Not really. I mean, what's interesting is, in my experience, it's been sort of case by case as well, institution to institution, city to city, state to state. And people have found workarounds to do certain things. It's very interesting. What would be really hard is doing these sorts of things outside of a museum setting or a gallery setting, in public spaces or whatnot, because of sort of fragility. They wouldn't pass muster on a lot of those public art requirements.
Well, I'm running over. I apologize. I know you're busy and you need to go work on your installation, but this was a wonderful conversation. Been a fan for a long time, you know, fellow Hoosiers and all that. But I'm so excited that you were able to take time off and join us today. Thank you so much, Roland. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks
Again,
everyone
if
for
you want
joining.
more information, I'm going to make sure you know about the seeds, get on that mailing list. Go to Rowland Ricketts website. It's rickettsiNdigo.com. There's all kinds of information there. And again, I think if there's a link to the, is there a link to that video I talked about earlier where you show all the different, how to make the compost? Okay, and we've also put that in the chat. So I encourage y'all to watch that video. It was pretty fascinating. We want to thank our sponsor. It was the Real Fiber and Paper Connection International. We appreciate them joining together. And you know, this is a great idea. If you feel like you can't really afford the to do a sponsorship, join up with somebody. We'd love that. That'd be great, especially if you have a common something in common. So thank you, Real Fibers. Thank you, Paper Connection International. We appreciate your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an episode of Textiles and Tea, you can do so by going to the website and going to Textiles and Tea and going and looking for the sponsorship there. And or if you have any questions, you can give me a call and we can talk. We've got Convergence coming up. It's amazing. So some of you probably already got either your magazine or you got the registration book, or both. The magazine will actually have the registration in here. So those are hitting mailboxes as we speak. If you don't want to wait for your mail, you can go online and you can see the PDF. You can download it, print it out, whatever you want to do. Start getting an idea of what classes you want to take, what seminars, workshops, see what different exhibits we have, the tours, the fashion show, much more. We've got vendors listed. Now, registration will open for everybody on October 23rd, okay? So the one way to say thank you to our donors is that if you've donated $100, you can register on October 15th. If you've donated over 300 or over, you can register on October the 9th. And you still have time if you're looking for a class and you think, I'm only coming for this class, and you want to make sure you get early registration, excuse me, you can still donate and become an early registration person. So go online, there's tons of information. The other thing is, if you know you're coming or you're pretty sure you're coming, book a room. They're filling up fast. We've got several hotels, and all that information again is on the website. Want to thank everybody for their support. Again, talking about donating to the Fiber Trust, a lot of these programs happen because of the donations to the Fiber Trust or sponsorships. So we want to thank everybody who's done that. Textiles and Tea, Spinning and Weaving Week, which is coming up fast. All of those happen because of your donations to HGA, and we do appreciate it. If you've missed any of the episodes, and I think we had a little trouble with Facebook earlier, it was not cooperating. You can go back and watch the whole program on YouTube. I don't know about Facebook. If Facebook didn't pick it up, it may not all be there. But if you want to see the whole show, you can look at it on YouTube. Next week, we have Liz Albert Fay. She's going to join us. Thank you all so much for being here today. I hope you enjoyed this program as much as I did, and hope you have a wonderful week. Happy tea.